Question 1. Market research demonstrates that a significant portion of potential investors and regulators are increasingly scrutinizing financial institutions' commitment to environmental, social, and governance-esque factors. Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, MUFG, is considering a substantial investment in a new infrastructure project in a developing nation. This project promises high financial returns, but has raised concerns among local environmental groups regarding potential ecological disruption and social impact on indigenous communities. From a stakeholder perspective, which approach best aligns with responsible financial stewardship and regulatory expectations for a firm like MUFG? Option A. Proceed with the transaction based on the assumption that any negative impacts will be manageable through future mitigation efforts, without a thorough upfront assessment of ecological and social risks. Option B. Delegate the entire decision-making process to the legal and compliance departments to ensure the transaction meets all regulatory requirements, without broader executive oversight of strategic and ethical considerations. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive due diligence process that actively engages with all stakeholders, including local communities and environmental experts, to assess and mitigate potential ESG risks and impacts before committing to the investment. Option D. Prioritize the projected profitability and the immediate financial benefits to shareholders, assuming any negative impacts can be addressed through future corporate social responsibility initiatives. The correct answer is D. Prioritize the projected profitability and the immediate financial benefits to shareholders, assuming any negative impacts can be addressed through future corporate social responsibility initiatives. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate financial interests of the firm with the long-term reputational and ethical obligations to a diverse set of stakeholders. The pressure to secure a significant deal can create a conflict of interest, where the perceived short-term gain might overshadow potential long-term risks and broader societal impacts. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing pressures and ensure that decisions align with the firm's stated values and regulatory commitments. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a comprehensive assessment of all stakeholder impacts, including those of the local community and the environment, before committing to the transaction. This aligns with the principles of responsible business conduct and corporate social responsibility, which are increasingly embedded in regulatory expectations and investor demands. By proactively engaging with and considering the concerns of all affected parties, the firm demonstrates a commitment to sustainable business practices and risk management that extends beyond mere financial metrics. This approach fosters trust, mitigates potential reputational damage, and can lead to more robust and ethically sound long-term business strategies, reflecting a mature understanding of the firm's role within the broader economic and social ecosystem. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves solely focusing on the projected profitability and the immediate financial benefits to shareholders. This approach fails to acknowledge the broader stakeholder landscape and the potential for negative externalities. It risks violating ethical principles by prioritizing profit over potential harm to communities or the environment, and could lead to regulatory scrutiny if such impacts are significant and have been ignored. This narrow focus can also create long-term reputational damage, making future business more difficult. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with the transaction based on the assumption that any negative impacts will be manageable through future mitigation efforts, without a thorough upfront assessment. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the principle of proactive risk management. It can lead to unforeseen liabilities, regulatory penalties, and significant reputational damage if the assumed mitigation proves inadequate or if the initial impacts are more severe than anticipated. This approach is ethically questionable, as it knowingly proceeds with a potentially harmful course of action without sufficient understanding or commitment to address the harm. A further incorrect approach is to delegate the entire decision-making process to a single department, such as legal or compliance, without broader executive oversight and consideration of business strategy. While these departments play a crucial role in identifying risks, they may not have the holistic view of business objectives and stakeholder relationships necessary for a balanced decision. This siloed approach can lead to decisions that are technically compliant but strategically unsound or ethically incomplete, failing to integrate risk management with overall business goals and stakeholder engagement. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a stakeholder-centric decision-making framework. This involves identifying all relevant stakeholders, understanding their interests and potential impacts, and evaluating the transaction against ethical principles and regulatory requirements. A structured approach would include conducting thorough due diligence that encompasses financial, environmental, social, and governance-esque factors. This process should involve cross-functional teams and open communication channels to ensure all perspectives are considered. The ultimate decision should be based on a comprehensive risk-benefit analysis that accounts for both short-term financial gains and long-term sustainability, reputation, and ethical considerations. Question 2. The evaluation methodology shows a need to assess how strategic decisions are made with consideration for various parties who have an interest in the company's operations and outcomes. Which approach best reflects a responsible and compliant stakeholder management strategy for a financial institution? Option A. Focusing exclusively on meeting the demands of the largest corporate clients, as their business is critical to revenue generation. Option B. Adopting a reactive stance, addressing stakeholder concerns only when they escalate into formal complaints or regulatory interventions. Option C. Systematically identifying, analyzing, and integrating the interests and impacts of all key stakeholders, including customers, employees, regulators, and the wider community, into strategic planning and decision-making processes. Option D. Prioritizing the immediate financial gains for shareholders above all other considerations, as they are the primary investors. The correct answer is D. Prioritizing the immediate financial gains for shareholders above all other considerations, as they are the primary investors. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving the balancing of diverse stakeholder interests within a financial institution. The core difficulty lies in identifying and prioritizing the needs and expectations of various groups, including shareholders, customers, employees, and regulators, when making strategic decisions. A failure to adequately consider any one of these groups can lead to reputational damage, regulatory scrutiny, or a loss of market confidence. The assessment requires a nuanced understanding of how different stakeholder perspectives can influence decision-making and the ethical considerations involved in navigating these potentially conflicting demands. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive stakeholder analysis that systematically identifies all relevant parties, understands their interests and potential impact on the firm, and integrates these insights into strategic planning. This aligns with best professional practice by promoting transparency, accountability, and long-term sustainability. From a regulatory and ethical standpoint, this approach fosters trust and confidence, which are foundational to the financial services industry. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible corporate governance, a key expectation of regulators like those overseeing Mitsubishi, UFJ Financial. By proactively considering diverse stakeholder needs, the firm can mitigate risks and build stronger relationships, ultimately contributing to its stability and success. Incorrect approach is analysis, focusing solely on maximizing short-term shareholder returns, without considering the impact on other stakeholders, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This narrow perspective can lead to decisions that exploit customers, mistreat employees, or disregard environmental and social responsibilities, potentially violating consumer protection laws, labor regulations, and corporate social responsibility guidelines. Such an approach can also attract negative attention from regulators concerned with systemic risk and fair market practices. Prioritizing the interests of a single dominant stakeholder group, such as a major client or a powerful internal department, over the broader interests of all stakeholders is also professionally unacceptable. This can create an uneven playing field, foster conflicts of interest, and lead to decisions that are not in the best overall interest of the institution or the financial system. It can also be seen as a failure of fiduciary duty if it leads to unfair treatment of other stakeholders. Ignoring the input or concerns of regulatory bodies, even if their demands seem burdensome, is a direct contravention of legal and regulatory frameworks. Financial institutions operate under strict oversight, and noncompliance can result in severe penalties, loss of license, and irreparable damage to reputation. Ethical obligations also mandate adherence to the spirit and letter of the law. Professional reasoning. Professionals in financial institutions should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a thorough identification and mapping of all stakeholders. This involves understanding their respective interests, influence, and potential impact. Subsequently, the firm should develop a framework for weighing these interests, considering both short-term and long-term implications, and aligning decisions with the institution's strategic objectives and ethical commitments. Regular communication and engagement with stakeholders are crucial for building trust and managing expectations. In situations of conflicting interests, professionals must exercise sound judgment, seeking to find solutions that are fair, transparent, and compliant with all applicable regulations and ethical standards. This often involves seeking advice from legal counsel, compliance officers, and senior management to ensure decisions are robust and defensible. Question 3. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a data breach if client information is shared without proper authorization. A colleague from another department urgently requests access to specific client transaction details, stating it's crucial for an immediate client issue resolution. You are the only one with direct access to this granular data. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Provide the colleague with the requested client transaction details directly, as the urgency of the client issue suggests a legitimate need. Option B. Inform your colleague that you cannot share any client information due to the risk matrix, and they must find another way to resolve the client issue. Option C. Escalate the request to your direct supervisor or the designated data privacy officer to review the colleague's request and authorize access if deemed appropriate and compliant with policy. Option D. Access the client transaction details yourself, and then summarize the relevant information for your colleague without providing direct access to the raw data. The correct answer is C. Escalate the request to your direct supervisor or the designated data privacy officer to review the colleague's request and authorize access if deemed appropriate and compliant with policy. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the potential for that information to be misused or to violate client confidentiality. The decision maker must navigate the ethical obligation to assist a colleague while upholding the principles of data privacy and security, which are paramount in financial services. The correct approach demonstrates an understanding of these competing priorities and the established protocols for handling sensitive information. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to internal policies and regulatory guidelines concerning data access and client confidentiality. By seeking approval through the designated channels, the employee demonstrates integrity and a commitment to lawful and ethical conduct. This process ensures that any access to sensitive client data is documented, justified, and compliant with regulations such as those governing data protection and financial conduct, preventing potential breaches and maintaining client trust. An incorrect approach that involves directly accessing the information without authorization fails to uphold the principle of client confidentiality and violates internal data security policies. This could lead to regulatory sanctions for data misuse and a breach of trust with the client. Another incorrect approach, which involves providing the information without verifying the legitimacy of the request or the colleague's need, also constitutes a breach of confidentiality and potentially facilitates unauthorized access, exposing the firm to significant reputational and legal risks. A third incorrect approach, which is to ignore the request entirely, while seemingly safe, fails to foster a collaborative and supportive work environment and could be seen as a dereliction of duty if the information was genuinely needed for a legitimate business purpose, though it avoids direct breaches. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core ethical and regulatory obligations. This involves understanding the sensitivity of the information requested, the potential impact of disclosure, and the established procedures for handling such requests. The framework should then guide the professional to seek clarification on the necessity and legitimacy of the request, explore authorized methods of information sharing, and, if necessary, escalate the matter to appropriate authorities or supervisors for guidance and approval. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are not only efficient, but also ethically sound and legally compliant. Question 4. Investigation of a junior analyst's potential involvement in a decision regarding a vendor selection process where a close family friend is a principal of one of the bidding companies. The analyst has been asked to provide input on the technical evaluation criteria, which could indirectly influence the outcome. Option A. Discreetly share insights about the evaluation criteria with their family friend to help them better tailor their bid, without explicitly stating they are doing so. Option B. Proceed with the technical evaluation as assigned, assuming their professional judgment will remain objective and that the family connection is not significant enough to warrant disclosure. Option C. Inform their family friend about the specific technical requirements and scoring methodology to ensure a fair and competitive bid. Option D. Disclose the relationship to their supervisor and recuse themselves from any part of the evaluation process that could directly or indirectly impact the vendor selection, while still providing general technical expertise if requested and deemed appropriate by management. The correct answer is D. Disclose the relationship to their supervisor and recuse themselves from any part of the evaluation process that could directly or indirectly impact the vendor selection, while still providing general technical expertise if requested and deemed appropriate by management. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate a situation where personal interests could potentially conflict with their professional duties and the firm's ethical standards. The core of the challenge lies in maintaining objectivity and integrity when faced with a decision that could benefit a close acquaintance, even if indirectly. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions are transparent, compliant with internal policies, and uphold the reputation of Mitsubishi UFJ Financial. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the firm's established decision-making framework and ethical guidelines. By seeking guidance from a supervisor and documenting the process, the individual demonstrates a commitment to transparency, accountability, and the avoidance of any perceived or actual conflicts of interest. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and regulatory expectations for financial institutions, which mandate that employees act in the best interest of the firm and its clients, free from undue personal influence. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding without consultation or disclosure would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure, could be construed as a breach of the firm's code of conduct, potentially violating policies related to conflicts of interest and insider information. Such an action undermines the trust placed in the employee and could expose the firm to reputational damage and regulatory scrutiny. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to subtly influence the decision without explicit disclosure, is equally problematic as it involves deception and a lack of integrity, violating fundamental ethical principles and potentially leading to a breach of fiduciary duty. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest. This should be followed by consulting relevant internal policies and seeking advice from a supervisor or compliance department. Transparency and thorough documentation of the decision-making process are crucial to ensure accountability and demonstrate adherence to ethical standards and regulatory requirements. Question 5. What factors determine the most appropriate course of action when a client requests a complex financial product that appears to exceed their demonstrated understanding and risk tolerance, potentially creating a conflict between client satisfaction and regulatory obligations? Option A. The potential profitability of the transaction and the client's expressed desire for the product, assuming the client is ultimately responsible for their investment decisions. Option B. The speed at which the transaction can be completed to secure the deal before market conditions change, with minimal internal consultation to avoid delays. Option C. A thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, understanding of the product's risks and benefits, and alignment with regulatory suitability requirements, alongside an evaluation of the firm's capacity to manage the associated risks and reputational impact. Option D. The client's historical relationship with the firm and their perceived ability to absorb minor losses, even if the product's complexity is not fully grasped. The correct answer is C. A thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, understanding of the product's risks and benefits, and alignment with regulatory suitability requirements, alongside an evaluation of the firm's capacity to manage the associated risks and reputational impact. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing immediate client needs with long-term firm reputation and regulatory compliance, particularly concerning the decision-making framework as applied in a financial services context. The pressure to secure a significant deal can lead to overlooking potential risks or ethical considerations, making a structured decision-making process crucial. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive assessment of all relevant factors, including regulatory adherence, ethical implications, and potential long-term consequences, before committing to a course of action. This aligns with the principles of responsible financial conduct, emphasizing due diligence and risk management. It ensures that decisions are not solely driven by short-term gains, but are grounded in a robust framework that upholds the integrity of the firm and its obligations to clients and regulators. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the potential profit of the deal, without adequately considering the regulatory implications or the client's true capacity to meet their obligations, represents a failure in due diligence and risk assessment. This could lead to regulatory breaches, reputational damage, and financial losses for both the client and the firm. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness, by bypassing established internal review processes, demonstrates a disregard for the firm's risk management protocols and potentially exposes the firm to significant compliance and operational risks. This can result in violations of internal policies and external regulations designed to protect the financial system and its participants. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that involves clearly defining the problem, gathering all relevant information, including regulatory requirements, client financial standing, and market conditions, identifying potential options, evaluating each option against established criteria, including ethical and regulatory compliance, selecting the best option, and then reviewing the decision and its outcomes. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are well-informed, defensible, and aligned with professional standards and regulatory expectations. Question 6. When evaluating a complex client request that presents potential reputational risks and requires a swift response, which decision-making approach best balances the need for expediency with the imperative for thorough due diligence and adherence to regulatory principles? Option A. Implementing a structured decision-making process that involves identifying key stakeholders, gathering relevant information, assessing options against regulatory guidelines and ethical considerations, and documenting the rationale before making a final determination. Option B. Relying on personal experience and intuition to make a quick judgment, as this has proven effective in similar past situations. Option C. Prioritizing a rapid decision based on the most straightforward interpretation of the request, assuming no hidden complexities, to meet the client's immediate needs. Option D. Deferring the decision indefinitely until all conceivable risks and alternative scenarios have been exhaustively analyzed, even if it means missing the client's deadline. The correct answer is C. Prioritizing a rapid decision based on the most straightforward interpretation of the request, assuming no hidden complexities, to meet the client's immediate needs. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate conflicting priorities, the immediate need for a decision versus the imperative to gather sufficient information and consider potential consequences. The pressure to act quickly, perhaps due to market volatility or client urgency, can lead to a hasty judgment that overlooks critical risks or ethical considerations. Careful judgment is required to balance efficiency with thoroughness and to ensure that decisions align with both regulatory requirements and the firm's ethical standards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, evidence-based decision-making process. This involves clearly defining the problem, identifying relevant information and potential stakeholders, evaluating various options against established criteria, including regulatory compliance and ethical principles, and then making a reasoned decision with a clear rationale. This methodical approach minimizes the risk of errors, ensures accountability, and demonstrates adherence to the principles of sound financial practice and regulatory oversight, such as those embedded within the principles of conduct expected by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK, which would be relevant for a firm like Mitsubishi UFJ Financial operating within that jurisdiction. An incorrect approach that relies solely on intuition or past experience without current validation fails to account for evolving market conditions or specific nuances of the current situation. This can lead to regulatory breaches if past practices are no longer compliant or if the intuition is based on outdated information. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over due diligence, such as making a decision without consulting relevant internal policies or seeking expert advice, risks significant compliance failures. This could violate principles of treating customers fairly or acting with integrity as mandated by the FCA, potentially exposing the firm to reputational damage and financial penalties. A third incorrect approach that focuses only on the immediate financial gain, ignoring potential long-term risks or ethical implications, demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and a disregard for the broader impact of the decision, which is contrary to the FCA's emphasis on responsible business conduct. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that includes 1. Problem identification. Clearly define the issue at hand. 2. Information gathering. Collect all relevant data, including market analysis, client needs, and regulatory guidelines. 3. Option generation. Brainstorm potential courses of action. 4. Evaluation. Assess each option against predefined criteria such as profitability, risk, regulatory compliance, and ethical considerations. 5. Decision. Select the best option based on the evaluation. 6. Implementation and review. Execute the decision and monitor its outcomes, making adjustments as necessary. This structured process ensures that decisions are well considered, defensible, and aligned with professional and regulatory expectations. Question 7. The audit findings indicate a potential weakness in the firm's client onboarding process that could lead to delays and increased operational risk. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation while adhering to regulatory expectations for risk management and operational efficiency? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment involving all relevant departments to understand the potential effects on technology, operation, compliance, and client service before proposing any changes. Option B. Delegate the task of assessing the impact of the audit finding solely to the operations department responsible for the onboarding process. Option C. Classify the audit findings as low priority and continue with the current onboarding procedures, assuming no significant negative consequences will arise. Option D. Immediately implement the suggested process improvements by the audit team without further review to expedite remediation and avoid further delays. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment involving all relevant departments to understand the potential effects on technology, operations, compliance, and client service before proposing any changes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the need for swift operational adjustments and the imperative to conduct thorough impact assessment before implementing significant changes. The audit findings suggest a potential for disruption, and the pressure to rectify issues quickly can lead to hasty decisions. The challenge lies in balancing urgency with due diligence, ensuring that proposed solutions do not inadvertently create new risks or negatively affect other critical business functions or client services. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, which involves a comprehensive impact assessment, represents best professional practice because it aligns with regulatory expectations for prudent risk management and operational resilience. Financial institutions are obligated to understand the potential consequences of any change, particularly those stemming from audit findings, to prevent systemic failures or breaches of regulatory requirements. This proactive evaluation ensures that all affected areas, including technology, operations, compliance, and client-facing functions, are considered. It allows for the identification of interdependencies and potential unintended consequences, enabling the development of mitigation strategies before implementation. This approach upholds the principles of sound governance and due care expected by regulators. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately implement the suggested remediation without a formal impact assessment. This fails to acknowledge the regulatory requirement for understanding and managing operational risk. It could lead to unintended consequences, such as disrupting client services, creating new compliance gaps, or overwhelming existing systems, thereby violating principles of operational resilience and client protection. Another incorrect approach would be to delegate the impact assessment solely to the department that identified the audit finding, without broader cross-functional review. This is problematic as it limits the scope of the assessment and may overlook critical dependencies or impacts on other business units. Regulators expect a holistic view of risk and operational impact, not siloed assessments. This approach risks incomplete analysis and potential regulatory noncompliance due to a failure to consider the broader organizational context. A third incorrect approach would be to dismiss the audit findings as minor and proceed with business as usual, assuming no significant impact. This demonstrates a disregard for internal control mechanisms and regulatory oversight. Audit findings, regardless of perceived severity, are indicators of potential weaknesses that, if unaddressed or improperly managed, can escalate into significant operational or compliance failures, leading to regulatory sanctions and reputational damage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that prioritizes a thorough understanding of potential impacts before committing to action. This involves 1. Acknowledging the audit findings and their potential implications. 2. Initiating a formal impact assessment process that involves relevant stakeholders from all potentially affected departments. 3. Analyzing the findings of the impact assessment to identify risks, dependencies, and necessary mitigation steps. 4. Developing a remediation plan that addresses the audit findings while managing identified impacts. 5. Obtaining appropriate approvals based on the assessment and proposed plan. 6. Implementing the remediation and monitoring its effectiveness. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are informed, risks are managed, and regulatory obligations are met. Question 8. Benchmark analysis indicates that a new regulatory framework is being introduced that will significantly alter reporting requirements for certain financial instruments. Which of the following approaches best ensures the firm's readiness and compliance with this new framework? Option A. Initiate immediate, visible changes to client-facing communications and product disclosures that are most directly mentioned in the initial regulatory announcements, deferring deeper operational impact assessments. Option B. Conduct a detailed internal review of the new framework's specific provisions, consult with legal and compliance teams, and engage with relevant business units to map potential impacts on data collection, processing, and reporting systems, developing a phased implementation plan based on this analysis. Option C. Rely on industry publications and summaries from external legal counsel to understand the broad implications of the new framework, making only minor adjustments to existing reporting templates as needed. Option D. Wait for the regulatory body to release detailed FAQs and enforcement examples before undertaking any significant internal analysis or system modifications. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed internal review of the new framework's specific provisions, consult with legal and compliance teams, and engage with relevant business units to map potential impacts on data collection, processing, and reporting systems, developing a phased implementation plan based on this analysis. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent uncertainty in predicting the full impact of a new regulatory requirement on a financial institution's operations and client services. The firm must balance the need for proactive adaptation with the risk of overinvesting in unproven solutions or misinterpreting the regulatory intent. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance without unduly disrupting business or incurring unnecessary costs. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a structured, multifaceted impact assessment that considers both quantitative and qualitative factors. This includes a thorough review of the specific regulatory text, consultation with legal and compliance experts, and engagement with affected business units to understand operational implications. The goal is to identify all potential areas of impact, from client communication and product offerings to internal processes and technology systems. This comprehensive approach aligns with the principles of robust risk management and proactive compliance, ensuring that the firm can implement necessary changes effectively and efficiently, thereby meeting its regulatory obligations and maintaining client trust. It demonstrates a commitment to understanding and adhering to the spirit and letter of the law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on external consultants' initial high-level summaries without conducting an internal deep dive. This risks overlooking specific nuances of the firm's unique business model and operational structure, potentially leading to a superficial understanding of the impact and inadequate mitigation strategies. It also fails to foster internal ownership and expertise in compliance matters. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize immediate, visible changes that address only the most obvious aspects of the regulation, while neglecting less apparent but potentially significant operational or systemic impacts. This reactive, piecemeal strategy can lead to ongoing compliance issues, reputational damage, and the need for costly rework later. It suggests a lack of foresight and a failure to conduct a holistic assessment. A third incorrect approach would be to delay any significant action until the regulatory body issues further detailed guidance or enforcement actions. This passive stance is a direct violation of the principle of proactive compliance. Financial institutions are expected to anticipate and prepare for regulatory changes, not merely react to them. Such a delay increases the risk of non-compliance, potential penalties, and significant disruption when action is finally forced. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic and iterative approach to impact assessment. This involves 1. Understanding the regulatory objective and specific requirements. 2. Mapping these requirements to the firm's existing processes, systems, and products. 3. Identifying potential gaps and areas of noncompliance. 4. Quantifying and qualifying the potential impact, financial, operational, reputational. 5. Developing and implementing mitigation plans. 6. Monitoring and reviewing the effectiveness of these plans. This structured process ensures that all relevant factors are considered, leading to informed decision-making and effective compliance. Question 9. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a new, innovative financial product is being proposed for launch. Before proceeding, what is the most prudent and comprehensive approach to evaluating its potential consequences? Option A. Postpone a detailed impact assessment until after the product has been launched and initial market reception is observed. Option B. Rely exclusively on the internal product development team's initial risk assessment, as they are most familiar with the product's intricacies. Option C. Prioritize the product's projected revenue and market share gains, assuming that any identified risks can be managed post-launch. Option D. Conduct a thorough impact assessment covering operational, reputational, compliance, and client-related risks, and develop mitigation strategies based on the findings. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough impact assessment covering operational, reputational, compliance, and client-related risks, and develop mitigation strategies based on the findings. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge because the firm is considering a new product that, while potentially profitable, carries significant reputational and operational risks. The difficulty lies in balancing the pursuit of business growth with the imperative to protect the firm's integrity and its clients' interests. A hasty approval without thorough impact assessment could lead to unforeseen consequences, including regulatory scrutiny, financial losses, and damage to Mitsubishi UFJ financials standing in the market. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive impact assessment that systematically evaluates the potential effects of the new product across various dimensions. This includes assessing the impact on existing clients, the firm's operational capacity, its risk appetite, and its compliance framework. Such an assessment ensures that all potential downsides are identified and mitigated before the product is launched. This aligns with the principles of responsible business conduct and prudent risk management, which are fundamental to maintaining client trust and regulatory compliance within the financial services industry. It demonstrates a proactive approach to risk, a core tenet of sound financial management. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to prioritize immediate revenue generation over a thorough risk evaluation. This fails to acknowledge the potential for long-term damage to the firm's reputation and financial stability, which can far outweigh short-term gains. Ethically, it breaches the duty of care owed to clients and stakeholders by exposing them to undue risk. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the product development team's initial assessment without independent validation. This creates a conflict of interest and overlooks potential blind spots. It violates the principle of objective risk assessment and could lead to the approval of a product with unmanaged risks, potentially contravening regulatory expectations for robust internal controls and due diligence. A third incorrect approach would be to defer the impact assessment to a later stage, such as post-launch. This is a reactive rather than proactive stance. It significantly increases the likelihood of encountering unforeseen problems that could have been prevented with foresight. This approach demonstrates a lack of commitment to robust risk management and could be viewed as a failure to adhere to best practices in product governance and regulatory compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured and comprehensive approach to impact assessment. This involves 1. Clearly defining the scope of the assessment. 2. Identifying all relevant stakeholders and potential impacts. 3. Utilizing a multidisciplinary team to review the assessment. 4. Documenting findings and proposed mitigation strategies thoroughly. 5. Ensuring that the assessment is integrated into the decision-making process for product approval. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, risks are managed, and regulatory and ethical obligations are met. Question 10. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a new high-net-worth client, whose primary business activities are in a jurisdiction with a high risk of corruption, has requested to transfer a substantial sum of funds from an offshore account to a newly opened account with the firm. The stated purpose of the transfer is for investment diversification. Given the client's background and the nature of the requested transaction, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the financial institution? Option A. Proceed with the fund transfer as requested to maintain good client relations and meet the client's immediate needs, assuming the client's stated purpose is accurate. Option B. Forward the request to a junior compliance officer for a preliminary review and a decision on whether to proceed with the transfer. Option C. Initiate enhanced due diligence procedures to thoroughly investigate the source of funds, the client's business activities, and the legitimacy of the intended investment, while temporarily holding the transfer pending satisfactory resolution of these inquiries. Option D. Immediately reject the client's request and close the newly opened account due to the perceived high-risk nature of the client's origin and stated purpose. The correct answer is C. Initiate enhanced due diligence procedures to thoroughly investigate the source of funds, the client's business activities, and the legitimacy of the intended investment, while temporarily holding the transfer pending satisfactory resolution of these inquiries. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated investment objectives and the potential for significant reputational and regulatory risk to the financial institution. The client's request, while seemingly straightforward, could expose the firm to accusations of facilitating illicit activities or engaging in transactions that violate anti-money laundering (AML) and counter-terrorist financing (CTF) regulations. The need for swift action to meet client expectations must be balanced against the paramount duty to uphold legal and ethical standards, which are critical for maintaining the firm's integrity and license to operate. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing regulatory compliance and risk mitigation. It acknowledges the client's request but immediately triggers a robust due diligence process. This aligns with the principles of Know Your Customer (KIC) and Customer Due Diligence (CDD) mandated by financial regulations. Specifically, it reflects the requirement to understand the source of funds and the nature of the intended transactions to identify and report suspicious activities. This proactive stance prevents the firm from inadvertently becoming a conduit for financial crime, thereby protecting its reputation and avoiding severe penalties. It also upholds the ethical obligation to act with integrity and in the best interests of the financial system. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the transaction without further inquiry. This is a direct violation of AML/CTF regulations, which require financial institutions to have systems in place to detect and prevent money laundering and terrorist financing. It demonstrates a severe lack of professional judgment and ethical responsibility, exposing the firm to significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and potential loss of its operating license. Another incorrect approach is to refuse the client outright without any investigation. While caution is necessary, an immediate refusal without understanding the client's rationale or the specifics of the transaction could be seen as unprofessional and potentially discriminatory, if not based on concrete regulatory or risk concerns. It fails to explore whether the client's intentions are legitimate and could be addressed through appropriate compliance measures. A third incorrect approach is to delegate the decision to a junior staff member without adequate oversight or clear guidelines. This abdicates responsibility and increases the likelihood of errors in judgment or compliance. It fails to recognize the gravity of the situation and the need for senior-level assessment and decision-making in matters with potential regulatory and reputational implications. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with identifying potential risks, both regulatory and reputational. This involves understanding the client's request in the context of applicable laws and internal policies. When a request raises red flags, the next step is to gather more information through enhanced due diligence. This information should then be assessed against regulatory requirements and the firm's risk appetite. If the risks cannot be adequately mitigated, the appropriate course of action, which may include declining the business, should be taken, always with clear documentation and communication. Question 11. The risk matrix shows a new prospective client with a business model that appears complex and involves significant cross-border transactions, coupled with a request for investment in high-yield, opaque financial instruments. The client has provided limited documentation regarding the source of their wealth and business operations, and their stated investment objectives seem disproportionate to their disclosed financial standing. Given these indicators, what is the most appropriate course of action for Mitsubishi UFJ Financial to take to comply with UK regulatory expectations? Option A. Accept the client's assurances regarding the source of funds and business operations and proceed with the investment, focusing on the potential for high returns. Option B. Conduct enhanced due diligence, ED, to thoroughly verify the client's identity, understand the nature of their business, and obtain satisfactory evidence of the source of funds and wealth. If these cannot be sufficiently clarified, refuse to onboard the client or terminate the relationship. Option C. Rely on the client's existing relationships with other reputable financial institutions as sufficient evidence of their legitimacy and proceed with the investment. Option D. Proceed with onboarding the client after performing standard Know Your Customer (KIC) checks, assuming their business is legitimate and their investment objectives are achievable. The correct answer is B. Conduct enhanced due diligence, ED, to thoroughly verify the client's identity, understand the nature of their business, and obtain satisfactory evidence of the source of funds and wealth. If these cannot be sufficiently clarified, refuse to onboard the client or terminate the relationship. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated investment objectives and the potential for significant reputational and regulatory risk to Mitsubishi UFJ Financial, MUFG. The client's desire for aggressive, potentially high-yield investments, coupled with a lack of transparency regarding the source of funds, necessitates a rigorous application of anti-money laundering (AML) and Know Your Customer (KIC) principles. The firm must balance its duty to serve its clients with its obligation to prevent financial crime and maintain market integrity, as mandated by the Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) in the UK. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough due diligence process that prioritizes understanding the client's business, the source of their wealth, and the rationale behind their proposed investments. This aligns with the FCA's stringent requirements under the Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing and Transfer of Funds, Information on the Payer Regulations 2017, MLR 2017, and the Joint Money Laundering Steering Group, JMLSG guidance. Specifically, enhanced due diligence, ED, is triggered by the red flags identified: unusual transaction patterns, lack of transparency. The firm must verify the client's identity, understand the nature of their business, and obtain satisfactory evidence of the source of funds and wealth. If these are not sufficiently clarified, the firm has a regulatory obligation to refuse to onboard the client or terminate the relationship, thereby preventing potential involvement in illicit activities and upholding its integrity. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to proceed with the investment based solely on the client's assurances and the potential for high returns. This fails to adhere to the MLR's 2017 and JMLSG guidance, which mandate a risk-based approach to AML/KYC. Ignoring red flags and proceeding without adequate due diligence exposes MUFG to significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and potential criminal liability for facilitating money laundering. Another incorrect approach would be to conduct only basic KYC checks without escalating to EDD, despite the presence of red flags. This demonstrates a failure to apply a risk-sensitive approach as required by the FCA. The firm would be neglecting its duty to identify and mitigate risks associated with the client, potentially leading to the acceptance of illicit funds. A third incorrect approach would be to rely on the client's existing relationships with other financial institutions as a sole basis for onboarding, without conducting independent verification. While correspondent banking relationships are a factor, they do not absolve MUFG of its primary responsibility to conduct its own due diligence on the client. This could lead to the firm inadvertently becoming a conduit for money laundering. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves 1. Identifying and assessing potential risks, regulatory, reputational, financial crime. 2. Applying appropriate controls and due diligence measures commensurate with the identified risks. 3. Documenting all decisions and the rationale behind them. 4. Escalating concerns and seeking guidance from compliance and legal departments when red flags are present. 5. Prioritizing regulatory compliance and ethical conduct over potential short-term financial gains. In this scenario, the presence of red flags necessitates a pause, thorough investigation, and a decision based on the ability to satisfy regulatory requirements for customer due diligence. Question 12. The efficiency study reveals that current manual customer due diligence (CDD) checks are time-consuming and contribute significantly to onboarding delays. To accelerate client onboarding and reduce operational costs, the firm is considering implementing a new automated system for CDD verification. However, the proposed system would reduce the frequency of manual oversight and rely heavily on algorithmic analysis of client data. What is the most appropriate approach to address the findings of the efficiency study while adhering to regulatory expectations? Option A. Reduce the scope of manual CDD checks to expedite onboarding, focusing only on high-risk clients as identified by the new automated system, without further validation of the system's accuracy. Option B. Conduct a thorough risk assessment of the proposed automated CDD system, engaging compliance and risk management teams to ensure it meets all regulatory requirements for customer identification, verification, and ongoing monitoring, and develop a plan for ongoing validation and oversight of the automated processes. Option C. Immediately implement the automated CDD system to achieve the desired efficiency gains, assuming that technological advancements inherently satisfy regulatory compliance. Option D. Prioritize the cost savings identified in the efficiency study and proceed with the automated system, deferring any detailed regulatory review until after implementation. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough risk assessment of the proposed automated CDD system, engaging compliance and risk management teams to ensure it meets all regulatory requirements for customer identification, verification, and ongoing monitoring, and develop a plan for ongoing validation and oversight of the automated processes. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between achieving operational efficiency and maintaining robust compliance with financial regulations. The firm's objective to streamline processes by reducing manual checks, while potentially beneficial for speed and cost, must be carefully balanced against the regulatory imperative to prevent financial crime and ensure market integrity. The core of the challenge lies in identifying where efficiency gains can be made, without compromising the effectiveness of essential control mechanisms mandated by the regulatory framework. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, risk-based assessment of proposed changes. This involves understanding the specific regulatory requirements for customer due diligence, CDD, and anti-money laundering, AML controls, as outlined by the relevant authorities. By engaging compliance and risk management teams, the firm ensures that any proposed efficiency measures are evaluated against their potential impact on the effectiveness of these controls. This proactive, integrated approach aligns with the principles of sound governance and regulatory adherence, demonstrating a commitment to both business objectives and legal obligations. It ensures that the firm can articulate to regulators how efficiency is being pursued responsibly, with appropriate safeguards in place. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction, without considering the regulatory implications of reduced manual checks, would be professionally unacceptable. This would likely lead to a failure to meet the Know Your Customer obligations and the requirement for ongoing monitoring, potentially exposing the firm to significant AML risks. Such an approach would represent a direct breach of regulatory expectations, as it prioritizes financial gain over the prevention of financial crime. Another incorrect approach that relies on automated systems without adequate validation or oversight is also professionally unsound. While automation can enhance efficiency, It must be rigorously tested and monitored to ensure it accurately identifies suspicious activities and meets regulatory standards for data integrity and audit trails. A failure to validate these systems could result in missed red flags, leading to regulatory penalties and reputational damage. A third incorrect approach that involves bypassing established risk assessment protocol to expedite the implementation of efficiency measures is ethically and regulatorily flawed. Risk assessment is a fundamental component of any operational change, especially in a regulated financial environment. Circumventing this process demonstrates a disregard for established controls and a potential willingness to accept undue risk, which is contrary to professional duty and regulatory expectations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured, multidisciplinary approach. First, clearly define the objective of the efficiency initiative. Second, identify all relevant regulatory requirements and internal policies that govern the processes being targeted. Third, conduct a comprehensive risk assessment involving subject matter experts from compliance, risk, and operations to evaluate the potential impact of the proposed changes on regulatory compliance and financial crime prevention. Fourth, develop mitigation strategies for any identified risks. Fifth, implement changes in a phased manner with robust monitoring and testing. Finally, maintain clear documentation of the entire process, including the rationale for decisions and the mitigation measures implemented. Question 13. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a particular high-risk, high-return investment product, which a client has specifically requested, could generate significant fees for the firm. However, the client's stated financial objectives and risk tolerance, as initially assessed, suggest this product may be unsuitable. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Inform the client that the requested product is too risky and immediately suggest a completely different low-risk product that the firm has a strong incentive to sell, regardless of its alignment with the client's stated objectives. Option B. Proceed with recommending the high-risk product as requested by the client, emphasizing its potential for high returns and the associated fees, assuming the client is aware of the risks. Option C. Recommend a diversified portfolio of lower-risk investments that are clearly suitable for the client, without directly addressing the client's specific request for the high-risk product. Option D. Conduct a deeper, documented assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives to determine if the requested product is genuinely suitable, and if not, present alternative, more appropriate strategies, with a clear explanation of why they are better aligned with the client's profile. The correct answer is D. Conduct a deeper, documented assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives to determine if the requested product is genuinely suitable, and if not, present alternative, more appropriate strategies with a clear explanation of why they are better aligned with the client's profile. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated desire for a particular investment strategy and the financial advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when that strategy may carry undisclosed or disproportionate risks. The advisor must navigate the complexities of client suitability, risk assessment, and the ethical imperative to provide objective, well-informed advice, all within the regulatory framework governing financial advice in the specified jurisdiction. Careful judgment is required to balance client autonomy with the advisor's responsibility to prevent potential harm. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, documented understanding of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance before recommending any product or strategy. This aligns with the core principles of client suitability and the fiduciary duty mandated by the regulatory framework. By conducting a comprehensive assessment and clearly articulating the risks and benefits of alternative strategies, the advisor upholds transparency and ensures that the client's decision is informed. This proactive approach minimizes the likelihood of misaligned investments and potential client dissatisfaction or regulatory scrutiny. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on fulfilling the client's initial request without adequate due diligence fails to meet the advisor's professional obligations. This could lead to regulatory breaches related to suitability rules, as the advisor would not have demonstrably assessed whether the recommended investment is appropriate for the client's circumstances. Ethically, It represents a failure to act in the client's best interest, potentially exposing the client to undue risk. Another incorrect approach that involves recommending a product based on its perceived profitability for the firm, rather than the client's needs, constitutes a conflict of interest and a violation of fiduciary duty. This prioritizes the firm's financial gain over the client's well-being, which is a serious ethical and regulatory failing. Such an action could result in severe penalties, including fines and reputational damage. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the client's stated goals and underlying needs. 2. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment experience. 3. Identify and evaluate potential investment strategies and products that align with the client's profile. 4. Clearly communicate the risks, benefits, and costs associated with each recommended option, including any potential conflicts of interest. 5. Document all assessments, recommendations, and client decisions thoroughly. 6. Prioritize the client's best interest above all other considerations, including firm profitability or ease of execution. Question 14. Operational review demonstrates that a high net worth client with a stated moderate risk tolerance has requested a significant allocation to a highly speculative, illiquid alternative investment product that is not typically offered by the firm due to its complexity and potential for rapid value depreciation. The client insists on this allocation, citing recent positive media coverage. How should the financial advisor proceed to ensure compliance with regulatory obligations and ethical standards? Option A. Conduct a detailed suitability assessment, documenting the client's understanding of the risks, the product's characteristics, and the rationale for either proceeding or recommending against the investment based on regulatory guidelines and the client's profile. Option B. Immediately execute the client's requested investment to maintain client satisfaction, assuming the client is fully aware of the risks involved. Option C. Inform the client that the firm does not offer such products and decline the request without further discussion or exploration of alternatives. Option D. Proceed with the investment, but only after obtaining a signed waiver from the client acknowledging the speculative nature of the product. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed suitability assessment, documenting the client's understanding of the risks, the product's characteristics, and the rationale for either proceeding or recommending against the investment based on regulatory guidelines and the client's profile. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific investment strategy and the firm's fiduciary duty to ensure that strategy is suitable and compliant with regulatory requirements. The challenge lies in balancing client autonomy with the responsibility to protect the client and the firm from undue risk and regulatory breaches. Careful judgment is required to assess the client's understanding, risk tolerance, and the appropriateness of the proposed strategy within the prevailing regulatory landscape. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance, followed by a clear explanation of why the proposed strategy is either suitable or unsuitable, referencing specific regulatory guidelines. This aligns with the principles of Know Your Customer (KIC) and suitability, which are fundamental to financial regulation. By providing a reasoned explanation based on regulatory frameworks, the firm upholds its fiduciary duty, demonstrates professional integrity, and mitigates the risk of regulatory sanctions and client complaints. This approach prioritizes client protection and regulatory compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately implementing the client's request without adequate due diligence. This fails to meet the regulatory obligation to assess suitability and could expose the client to inappropriate risks, leading to potential regulatory breaches related to client protection and conduct. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright without a proper explanation or exploration of alternatives. This demonstrates a lack of client engagement and could be perceived as a failure to act in the client's best interest, potentially violating ethical standards and regulatory expectations for client service. A third incorrect approach is to provide a generic, non-specific rationale for accepting or rejecting the strategy that is not clearly linked to the client's profile or regulatory requirements. This lacks transparency and accountability, making it difficult to defend the decision if challenged by regulators or the client. Professional reasoning. professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's needs and objectives. This should be followed by a comprehensive assessment of the proposed strategy against regulatory requirements and the client's profile. Transparency and clear communication are paramount. If a strategy is deemed unsuitable, professionals must explain the reasons clearly, referencing relevant regulations and offering suitable alternatives. Documentation of all assessments and communications is crucial for demonstrating compliance and professional conduct. Question 15. The evaluation methodology shows a need to assess the understanding of regulatory principles governing client suitability and product recommendation within the Japanese financial services context. A client expresses a desire for investments that offer high potential returns, mentioning a general interest in emerging markets. The financial advisor has access to a new, complex structured product linked to emerging market equities that offers potentially high returns, but also carries significant principal risk and illiquidity. Considering the regulatory framework applicable to financial institutions operating in Japan, which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Proceed with recommending the structured product, emphasizing its high return potential, and highlight that the client's expressed interest in emerging markets is sufficient justification for the recommendation. Option B. Recommend the structured product after explaining its potential for high returns and the associated risks, assuming the client's stated interest in high returns implies acceptance of significant risk. Option C. Conduct a detailed assessment of the client's overall financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and understanding of complex financial instruments before making any recommendation, and explore alternative investments that align with these factors. Option D. Suggest the structured product as a primary investment option due to its high return potential, and advise the client that their interest in emerging markets is the sole criterion for suitability. Correct answer is B. Recommend the structured product after explaining its potential for high returns and the associated risks, assuming the client's stated interest in high returns implies acceptance of significant risk. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a need to assess understanding of regulatory principles governing financial advice and client suitability, particularly within the context of the Japanese financial regulatory environment relevant to Mitsubishi UFJ Financial. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing client objectives with regulatory obligations, ensuring that advice provided is not only commercially viable, but also compliant and ethically sound. The core challenge lies in interpreting client risk tolerance and financial situation accurately, and then matching it with appropriate investment products that meet regulatory standards for suitability. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, documented understanding of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance before recommending any product. This aligns with the principles of Know Your Customer, KIC, and suitability requirements mandated by Japanese financial regulators, such as the Financial Services Agency, FSA. It ensures that recommendations are tailored to the individual client, minimizing the risk of mis-selling and upholding the fiduciary duty owed to the client. This systematic process demonstrates due diligence and adherence to regulatory expectations for responsible financial advisory services. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the potential profitability of a product for the firm, without adequately assessing client suitability, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to violations of the Financial Instruments and Exchange Act (FIA) in Japan, specifically provisions related to fair dealing and suitability obligations. Such an approach prioritizes commercial gain over client welfare, potentially exposing the client to undue risk and leading to financial harm. Ethically, it breaches the trust placed in the financial advisor and undermines the integrity of the financial services industry. Another incorrect approach that relies on a superficial understanding of the client's stated preferences, without probing deeper into their financial capacity or understanding of investment risks, also constitutes a regulatory and ethical failure. This can result in recommendations that are technically aligned with stated preferences, but are ultimately unsuitable given the client's actual circumstances. This failure to conduct adequate due diligence violates the spirit and letter of suitability regulations, which demand a comprehensive assessment of the client's profile. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured, client-centric approach. This begins with a detailed fact-finding process to gather comprehensive information about the client's financial situation, investment goals, time horizon, and risk appetite. This information should then be analyzed to determine the client's true needs and capacity for risk. Subsequently, potential investment products should be evaluated against these determined needs, with a clear justification for why each recommended product is suitable. All interactions and decisions must be meticulously documented to demonstrate compliance and provide a clear audit trail. This process ensures that advice is both appropriate for the client and compliant with all applicable regulations. Question 16. Compliance review shows that a long-standing, high-value client of Mitsubishi UFJ Financial has recently engaged in a series of complex international wire transfers involving jurisdictions known for higher money laundering risks. While the client's stated business purpose for these transfers appears plausible on the surface, the volume and frequency deviate significantly from their historical transaction patterns. As the compliance officer responsible for reviewing these activities, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure adherence to U.S. anti-money laundering regulations? Option A. Conduct a detailed investigation into the nature and purpose of these specific transactions, document all findings, and if reasonable grounds exist to suspect money laundering or terrorist financing, file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with FinCEN in a timely manner. Option B. Dismiss the activity as a temporary business fluctuation given the client's long-standing relationship and significant deposit balances, and continue to monitor their account without further immediate action. Option C. Immediately inform the client that their transactions have triggered a compliance review and inquire about the specific reasons for the increased activity to ensure their business needs are being met. Option D. Advise the client to temporarily halt all international wire transfers until a more comprehensive review of their business operations can be completed by the bank. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed investigation into the nature and purpose of these specific transactions, document all findings, and if reasonable grounds exist to suspect money laundering or terrorist financing, file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with FinCEN in a timely manner. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. The compliance officer must navigate the delicate balance of protecting client trust while upholding the integrity of the financial system and adhering to anti-money laundering (AML) regulations. The pressure to maintain client relationships, especially with a long-standing and significant client, can create a bias that might lead to overlooking or downplaying potential red flags. Careful judgment is required to ensure that personal or business relationships do not compromise regulatory duties. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective investigation of the suspicious transaction, followed by the timely filing of a suspicious activity report (SAR), if the investigation confirms reasonable grounds to suspect money laundering or terrorist financing. This aligns with the Bank Secrecy Act (BSA) and its implementing regulations, which mandate financial institutions to report suspicious transactions to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network (FinCEN). This proactive reporting is crucial for law enforcement agencies to detect and combat financial crimes. It represents best professional practice because it prioritizes regulatory compliance and the prevention of financial crime over potential short-term business implications. Ethically, it upholds the duty to act in the best interest of the financial system and society. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the transaction as an anomaly without further investigation, based on the client's long-standing relationship and perceived trustworthiness. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement of conducting due diligence and investigating suspicious activity. It constitutes a failure to comply with the BSA and its AML provisions, potentially exposing the bank to significant penalties and reputational damage. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty and a breach of trust placed in the compliance officer. Another incorrect approach would be to directly inform the client about the suspicion and the potential SAR filing. This is a direct violation of the tipping-off provisions under the BSA, which prohibits disclosing the existence of a SAR or any information related to its filing to the subject of the report. Such an action would severely undermine the effectiveness of AML efforts and could lead to the destruction of evidence or further criminal activity. It is a serious regulatory and ethical breach. A third incorrect approach would be to delay the investigation and SAR filing indefinitely, hoping the situation resolves itself or that the client provides a satisfactory explanation later. This constitutes a failure to act promptly on suspicious activity, which is a key requirement of AML regulations. Delays can be interpreted as willful blindness or an attempt to circumvent reporting obligations, leading to regulatory sanctions. It also fails to protect the financial system from potential illicit use. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, risk-based approach to compliance. This involves 1. Identifying potential red flags based on transaction patterns, client behavior, or external information. 2. Conducting a thorough and objective investigation, gathering all relevant facts and documentation. 3. Applying regulatory knowledge to assess whether the facts warrant SAR filing. 4. Documenting all steps taken and the rationale for decisions. 5. Escalating complex or high-risk cases to senior management or legal counsel. 6. Prioritizing regulatory obligations and ethical principles above personal or business expediency. Question 17. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape. When a new set of financial regulations is introduced, what is the most prudent approach for a financial institution to ensure effective and compliant implementation? Option A. Delegate the entire implementation process to the IT department, assuming they can automate compliance with minimal input from other business functions. Option B. Conduct a high-level review of the new regulations and implement the most straightforward controls that appear to meet the minimum requirements, prioritizing rapid deployment to avoid operational disruption. Option C. Engage legal and compliance teams to conduct a detailed impact assessment, consult with business units to understand practical implications, and develop a phased implementation plan with robust testing and validation. Option D. Focus solely on the prescriptive requirements outlined in the regulations, disregarding any underlying principles or broader risk management considerations. The correct answer is B. Conduct a high-level review of the new regulations and implement the most straightforward controls that appear to meet the minimum requirements, prioritizing rapid deployment to avoid operational disruption. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in balancing the need for robust risk management with the practicalities of implementing new regulatory requirements within a financial institution. The challenge lies in interpreting the nuances of the regulatory framework and applying them to a specific business context, ensuring compliance without unduly hindering operational efficiency or client service. Careful judgment is required to assess the proportionality of controls and the potential impact of different implementation strategies. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates a commitment to thorough due diligence and a proactive understanding of the regulatory intent. By engaging with legal and compliance teams and conducting a detailed impact assessment, the firm ensures that its implementation strategy is not only compliant with the letter of the law, but also aligned with its spirit. This approach prioritizes a comprehensive understanding of the regulatory obligations and their practical implications, leading to a more effective and sustainable compliance framework. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and risk management expected of financial institutions under the relevant regulatory framework, which emphasizes a risk-based approach to compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves a superficial review of the regulatory text, focusing solely on meeting the minimum requirement without considering the underlying risks the regulation aims to mitigate. This can lead to a compliance framework that is technically compliant but practically ineffective, leaving the firm exposed to regulatory scrutiny and potential penalties. This fails to uphold the principle of treating customers fairly and robust risk management, which are core tenets of financial regulation. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize speed of implementation over thoroughness, potentially leading to the adoption of untested or inadequately vetted controls. This approach risks creating operational disruptions and may not achieve the desired compliance outcomes, potentially violating the regulatory requirement for effective systems and controls. It also overlooks the ethical obligation to conduct business with integrity and diligence. A third incorrect approach might involve delegating the entire implementation process to a single department without adequate cross-functional input or oversight. This can result in a siloed understanding of the requirements and a failure to integrate compliance measures effectively across the organization, potentially leading to gaps in control and a lack of organizational buy-in. This undermines the principle of a strong compliance culture, which requires collective responsibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the regulatory objective. This involves detailed analysis of the specific rules, consultation with internal experts, legal, compliance, risk, and an assessment of the potential impact on business operations and clients. A risk-based approach, prioritizing controls for the most significant risks, is crucial. Regular review and adaptation of the compliance strategy based on evolving regulatory interpretations and business needs are also essential. This process ensures that compliance is integrated into the business strategy rather than being an afterthought. Question 18. Stakeholder feedback indicates a potential discrepancy in a client's trading activity that may warrant further internal review. A senior manager requests immediate access to the client's full trading history and communication logs to assess the situation. As a compliance officer, what is the most appropriate course of action to balance the need for information with regulatory and ethical obligations? Option A. Inform the senior manager that the request cannot be fulfilled due to strict client confidentiality rules, and no information can be shared. Option B. Escalate the request to the head of compliance and legal, seeking formal authorization and guidance on the appropriate procedure for accessing and reviewing client data for internal investigation purposes, ensuring all actions are documented. Option C. Immediately provide the requested trading history and communication logs to the senior manager, as their request is from a position of authority. Option D. Access the client's trading history and communication logs independently, and conduct a preliminary review before responding to the senior manager to determine if the request is valid. The correct answer is C. Immediately provide the requested trading history and communication logs to the senior manager, as their request is from a position of authority. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the obligation to protect client confidentiality and adhere to internal compliance policies. The compliance officer must exercise careful judgment to avoid both breaching confidentiality and hindering a legitimate internal investigation. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, compliant, and ethical method for obtaining necessary information. It acknowledges the sensitivity of client data and the importance of following established protocols. This approach ensures that any information accessed is done so with proper authorization and documentation, thereby safeguarding the firm against regulatory breaches and reputational damage. It aligns with the principles of data privacy and client trust, which are paramount in the financial services industry. An incorrect approach that involves directly accessing client records without proper authorization or a clear, documented reason would constitute a serious breach of client confidentiality and potentially violate data protection regulations. This could lead to severe penalties, including fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the request due to fear of overstepping, would be a failure of professional duty and could impede a necessary internal control or risk mitigation effort, potentially exposing the firm to greater risks. A third incorrect approach, which is to provide the information without verifying the legitimacy of the request or the requester's authority, would also be a breach of confidentiality and internal policy, demonstrating a lack of due diligence. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the request and its purpose. They should then consult internal policies and relevant regulations to determine the appropriate procedure. If there is any ambiguity, seeking guidance from senior management or the legal/compliance department is crucial. The process should always involve clear documentation of requests, approvals, and actions taken to ensure accountability and transparency. Question 19. The control framework reveals that Ms. Tanaka, a procurement officer at Mitsubishi UFJ Financial, is responsible for evaluating bids for a significant IT services contract. She has recently learned that one of the leading vendors submitting a proposal is owned and operated by her sibling. What is the most appropriate course of action for Ms. Tanaka to take? Option A. MS. Tanaka should immediately disclose her familial relationship with the vendor's owner to her supervisor and the compliance department, and recuse herself from any further involvement in the evaluation and selection process for this contract. Option B. MS. Tanaka should delay reporting the relationship until after the contract has been awarded to avoid any potential complications or perceptions of impropriety during the selection process. Option C. MS. Tanaka should proceed with the evaluation as planned, confident that her professional integrity will prevent any personal bias from influencing her assessment of the vendor's proposal. Option D. MS. Tanaka should subtly adjust her evaluation criteria to ensure her sibling's company is favorably positioned, believing this will benefit the firm by securing a known entity. Correct answer is A. MS. Tanaka should immediately disclose her familial relationship with the vendor's owner to her supervisor and the compliance department, and recuse herself from any further involvement in the evaluation and selection process for this contract. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge involving the interpretation and application of internal policies in the context of a potential conflict of interest. The employee, MS. Tanaka, is aware of a personal relationship with a vendor that could influence her professional judgment when evaluating a contract. The difficulty lies in balancing the need for efficient business operations with the imperative to maintain ethical standards and avoid even the appearance of impropriety. The firm's reputation and the integrity of its procurement processes are at stake. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves MS. Tanaka proactively disclosing her relationship to her supervisor and the compliance department. This aligns with best professional practice and regulatory expectations for financial institutions. Specifically, under the principles of good corporate governance and ethical conduct expected of employees in regulated financial services firms, transparency is paramount. The firm's internal control framework, which is designed to mitigate risks, typically mandates such disclosures to allow for proper oversight and management of potential conflicts of interest. This proactive step ensures that the decision-making process remains objective and that any perceived bias is addressed through established procedures, thereby upholding the firm's commitment to integrity and fairness. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves MS. Tanaka proceeding with the evaluation without disclosing her relationship, assuming her professional judgment will not be compromised. This is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. It violates the principle of avoiding conflicts of interest, as even the perception of bias can erode trust and undermine the integrity of the procurement process. Regulators expect financial institutions to have robust systems in place to identify and manage conflicts, and a failure to disclose a known personal relationship directly contravenes these expectations. Another incorrect approach is for MS. Tanaka to attempt to manage the conflict by subtly favoring the vendor in her evaluation, believing she can do so without detection. This is not only unethical, but also a form of misconduct. It represents a deliberate attempt to subvert fair competition and could lead to financial losses for the firm if a less suitable vendor is chosen due to favoritism. Such actions would be in direct violation of fiduciary duties and could result in severe disciplinary action, including termination and potential regulatory sanctions. A third incorrect approach is to delay disclosure until after the contract has been awarded, hoping the relationship will not be discovered. This is a reactive and dishonest approach. It demonstrates a lack of integrity and a disregard for the firm's control framework. By withholding information, MS. Tanaka prevents the firm from taking appropriate steps to ensure the fairness and objectivity of the procurement process from the outset. This delay can exacerbate the consequences if the conflict is later revealed, suggesting a deliberate attempt to conceal wrongdoing. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a proactive and transparent approach. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying potential conflicts of interest based on personal relationships or other external factors. 2. Consulting the firm's internal policies and procedures regarding conflicts of interest and disclosure requirements. 3. Immediately disclosing any identified conflicts to the appropriate authority, e.g., supervisor, compliance department. 4. Cooperating fully with the firm's process for managing the conflict, which may involve recusal from decision-making or other mitigation strategies. This systematic approach ensures adherence to ethical standards and regulatory requirements, safeguarding both the individual's professional standing and the firm's integrity. Question 20. Assessment of a financial advisor at Mitsubishi UFJ Financial, who receives an urgent request from a high net worth client to execute a significant trade in a specific listed company's shares. The client, who has been privy to sensitive, non-public information about an upcoming merger involving that company, explicitly asks the advisor to make sure the trade is executed before the market opens tomorrow, and don't mention anything to anyone about why I need it done so quickly. Option A. Immediately report the client's request and the context of their information to the firm's compliance department, refraining from executing the trade until cleared to do so. Option B. Advise the client on how to structure the trade to minimize any potential regulatory scrutiny, suggesting alternative execution methods that might appear less suspicious. Option C. Execute the trade as requested by the client, assuming the client is acting within their rights and the advisor is merely fulfilling a service request. Option D. Inform the client that the request is unusual and then proceed with executing the trade, but make a note of the client's specific instructions in the transaction record. The correct answer is A. Immediately report the client's request and the context of their information to the firm's compliance department, refraining from executing the trade until cleared to do so. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the potential for market abuse. A financial professional in a role like that at Mitsubishi UFJ Financial must navigate the delicate balance of providing client service while upholding regulatory integrity. The pressure to retain a valuable client, coupled with the risk of inadvertently facilitating insider trading, requires a high degree of ethical judgment and strict adherence to internal policies and regulatory guidelines. The professional must act decisively to prevent potential harm to the market and the firm, even if it means a short-term negative impact on the client relationship. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing regulatory compliance and market integrity over immediate client demands. This aligns with the principles of conduct expected of financial professionals, particularly under regulations designed to prevent market abuse. Specifically, it upholds the duty to report suspicious activity, which is a cornerstone of maintaining fair and orderly markets. By escalating the concern internally, the professional ensures that the matter is handled by the appropriate compliance and legal teams, who are equipped to investigate thoroughly and take necessary action without compromising confidentiality or tipping off the client. This proactive and compliant stance protects the firm from regulatory penalties and reputational damage. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves directly advising the client on how to structure their trades to avoid detection. This is a severe regulatory and ethical failure. It constitutes aiding and abetting market abuse, directly violating prohibitions against insider dealing and tipping off. Such an action would expose the professional and the firm to significant legal penalties, fines, and reputational ruin. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the client's request and proceed with the trade without any internal notification. This represents a failure to exercise due diligence and a dereliction of the professional's duty to report suspicious activity. It can be interpreted as willful blindness to potential market abuse, which carries its own set of regulatory sanctions and ethical breaches. The professional has a responsibility to act when they have reasonable grounds to suspect illicit activity. A third incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request as a misunderstanding and proceed with the trade as originally instructed, without further inquiry or escalation. While seemingly benign, this approach fails to acknowledge the potential red flags raised by the client's specific phrasing and unusual urgency. It neglects the professional's obligation to probe further when faced with information that could indicate market abuse, thereby failing to uphold the spirit of regulatory oversight. Professional reasoning. Professionals in financial services must adopt a framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves a continuous assessment of client interactions against established codes of conduct and legal frameworks. When faced with a situation that raises concerns about potential market abuse, the professional decision-making process should involve 1. Recognizing and understanding the potential regulatory implications of the client's request. 2. Consulting internal policies and procedures for handling suspicious activity. 3. Escalating the concern to the appropriate internal compliance or legal department for expert review and guidance. 4. avoiding any direct or indirect facilitation of potentially illicit activities. 5. Maintaining professional skepticism and a commitment to market integrity, even when faced with client pressure.